I feel that. All right, I can't sit here and say that I am a full believer. I'm not. I am a believer in the fact that there are many facets of our physical existence here on this planet that remain unexplained. But that doesn't mean to say that there isn't an explanation for them on some level, whether it be, a level that is currently fathomable by us as a species at our level of development, So having said that, though, I certainly believe that there are unexplained events and senses that we possess that tell us when we are in the presence of certain energies. And so I would be a believer in a sense of free-forming energy and some sort of inherent ability in our physical makeup that we can in some way sense that presence. And so that's about as vague, I think, an explanation as anybody could give. But I suppose to paraphrase it, it would be that I believe there is a certain unexplained something that we have yet to truly understand. I think I would be the last to discredit people's experiences, and people's experiences can be vivid and real, and I'm in no position to question that, nor would I want to. Like I say, my own experience, which I witnessed with my own eyes, is still indelibly printed in my mind, even from all those years ago, and so it certainly made that an impact, and at the end of the day, I truly want to believe that what I was looking at was something unexplained, even now, and I'm going to continue believing that. My experience tells me that regardless of what it was pretty incredible.
Hello? Welcome.
This is the Two Cities.
Oh, I'm so excited.
Hello, everyone. This is another special episode. For those that are wondering, I do also have a family as well. We've been recording with Nikki's grandma, and now we're going to be recording with my father. So, Father, hello.
Good morning, world.
And the reason for this episode is because I have a deep, dark secret. There is a paranormal story connected with my family. And it was national?
It was national UK. National.
Yeah, national UK. So that's like a little bit, extra spice right there. And right now, I think I'm going to just throw it off to Dad to tell the story. So, Father, go ahead. Oh, my father's name is Howard, by the way.
So I was going to say, Ellie, maybe tell the listeners what your dad's name is.
Yeah, so everyone would be like, hi, Father.
you have a dad, and he has a name.
Yes. Hello, Father.
He's not a priest.
Yes. Yes. So, Dad, basically, go ahead, start telling the story.
Okay. So, the story, my little paranormal experience, dates back to the 60s. I'm going to say 1965, which would have made me 8 years old. And at the time, recovering from a fairly severe illness. I was recovering from bronchitis, and I'd been sort of housebound for about a month or so, which... That's a month in an 8-year-old's memory, so it could have been
like
a week, could have been an hour. Nobody knows. But I was sort of off school and recovering, and at the same time, I'm going to say like second cousin, third removed, something like that, was just up the street from us, like in a block or so up the street, where his mother, my somehow estranged relation, I forget the exact connection, but on a kind of second cousin sort of basis. But his mother was the landlord of a pub that was just up the road from my father's shop. And I lived above, or we at the time lived above the shop, and my aunt and my cousin lived in the apartment above the pub. And before that, their grandmother, who I think had been in some way connected to my grandfather, lived in that same location. And when she lived there, this would have been the 50s, I guess, late 50s maybe. She was at some point bedridden, and I'm not sure if that was a permanent situation or whether or not it was temporary. But anyway, she was confined to her bed, and that was in a room that was immediately above the bar downstairs. And so whenever she needed attention in some way, shape or form, she would bang on the floor with a walking stick that was a simple cane walking stick in a very sort of, in my mind's eye, which again is distorted by many years at this point, but I remember it as a Charlie Chaplin type walking stick. So that would have, it wasn't really bamboo, but it was some sort of cane, had texture. And this walking stick at some point had belonged to my grandfather, and before that, who knows whatever. It was a fairly old walking stick. It was certainly multi-generational. But anyway, it had come into this lady's ownership of in some way, and so she used it to bang for attention. And so that went on for many years, but she passed away, and when she passed away, the cane was simply put on top of the wardrobe in that particular room. In England, closets are not built in like they are in America, but they are contained as individual standing pieces of furniture, so it's a wardrobe. And so the cane had been put on top of the wardrobe and left and forgotten. So skip ahead X number of years, who knows how many, and my cousin is also laying in bed recovering, or actually just about to succumb to some affliction, whatever. He had been off school, I think, for a week or so, and whether or not it was bronchitis or so, whatever, it was a common thread, it seems, in those days. But anyway, he too was confined and off school, and so.
And this is like 1970.
This is 1965.
1965. So that would be like, and that's close to like the coal mining area.
Okay, the town I grew up in was a coal mining town, so very much a mining community. So it was terraced houses and dark satanic mills and clouds of dust and expectations of an early death. So
the fun things.
Yeah,
The fun things to remember.
Fun times.
Optimism.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Fun times. Anyway. So my cousin found himself in the room that had once belonged to what would have been his grandmother, and confined to bed. And one night, and it was barely even noticed, but one night he was asleep and woke up the next morning to find the cane had fallen off the top of the wardrobe, or at least that was the concept. And that was not unusual. Both of us lived next door, right on a very heavy main road, and there was a lot of traffic, and of course it was sort of rumbling old style traffic, so it wasn't, necessarily that strange that the stick had fallen off the roof, off the wardrobe, and whatever, and so it was again in my memory was simply put back on and forgotten. And the next night, or rather the next morning, when everybody woke up, the stick was halfway down the stairs. Again, really. It was like, okay, this is curious. What's this stick doing down here? But I'm so busy, I don't really care. And now it was gone and forgotten again. And so, but whoever, my aunt or whoever was busy, maybe, I forget the exact sequence of events, but for whatever reason, the stick was simply placed over the end of the bed, rather than going to the extra effort of putting it back up onto the wardrobe. And that was fine, and nobody again thought anything of it, until later that day, the stick started moving from one side of the bed to the other side of the bed, And now people's attention were definitely being drawn, especially my cousin, because it seemed as though whatever was happening with this stick was in some way connected to my cousin's illness, or his, what then became subsequent recovery and return to school, because the span of life of this effect of whatever was happening with this stick was the exact span that my cousin was confined to his bed in that room. And once that period of time of confinement had come to an end, he was going to return to school. And so this thing happened, and this phenomena started to happen, and nobody had an explanation for it. It was through I forget the exact connections, but whatever it is, the press became involved. Somebody got to hear of what was going on, and the press started coming over, and the press at that time was represented by, I'm sure, the Barnsley Chronicle, which was a weekly local newspaper, still in business, and probably the Sheffield Star or the Yorkshire Post, which are more city-based newspapers and a much more sort of regional coverage, but anyway, the word started to get out. But interestingly enough, the moment that any journalist or photographer stepped into the room, all activity would cease. It just wouldn't, there was no activity at all. The moment they stepped out, the stick became alive again. So, well, when we say alive, animated in some way. It's really, and to this day, I still have no explanation for what was going on. And of course, at this point, I was only hearing of this by second hand because I too was confined. But eventually, it got to the point where I was well enough to be, we headed up to the pub up the road, and sure enough, into the bedroom, which was so familiar because, of course, we'd spend our whole lives sort of like crisscrossing as you do. I remember walking into the bedroom, and there was the cane on the end of the bed, and it was like it was floating over the end of the bed. So if you imagine the hook of the cane, of the handle, hooked over the end rail of the bed. It was an old, Victorian railed bed, so there was a very elaborate headboard, and then a board. I'll say footboard because I don't really know what that's called. But the posts on the corner, and then a sort of a smaller rail type structure at the foot of the bed. Like a sort of like a handle kind of height, and so the walking stick was hooked over the end of the bed, and it was literally floating from side to side, occasionally stopping. And by this time, this phenomena was a week and a half old or something. So when I arrived, first of all, I had to sort of struggle through a throng of reporters and other interested, parties that were crowding the hallway outside the room. And I then went in with I seem to remember it was my Auntie Nora that I went with at the time. It could have been my father, I'm not sure. My mother had recently died, maybe a month earlier than this, so I was still very much in a kind of a very weird place. But anyway, I remember sort of walking into this thing and seeing there was 2 or 3 people in the room at the time. I forget exactly who it was. My cousin, of course, who was in bed just loving all this attention. And so I sort of observed through the eyes of an 8-year-old, and I think I can only ascribe that in terms of the fact that what I was seeing was in no way ominous in any way. There was no sense of darkness about this thing at all. It was as though, and again, I sort of emphasised through my sort of immature eyes at the time, or naive eyes, but it seemed so natural. It seemed so, in its own way, so ordinary. Mm-hmm. It was like, oh, and there's a walking stick floating across the end of the bed. How are you doing? So it was very strange. So, like I said, at this point, the phenomena was I don't know, a week and a half or something of that nature. And so there had already been established some kind of communicative code that was going on in terms of the way that the walking stick would knock twice for yes, once for no, whatever things had been going on. And you could ask it in ways that could be interpreted by knocks. And so I asked it to play, I think, Bar Bar Black Sheep, which, And so that was fine, and everybody was laughing. And I remember then I said, do you remember my grandfather, Percy? And it knocked twice for no, or once for no, whichever no was. That was it. That was the answer, which I thought was a bit strange because this stick had apparently belonged to my grandfather, but who knows how long stick memories are, But again, it was like there was such a sense of ordinariness about the whole thing, and almost a sort of like a playfulness about the whole encounter. And anyway, throughout the course of this entire event, it grew from, I think the local press became involved, and then, of course, eventually the national press became involved. And then David Nixon arrived. David Nixon was a very, very popular English magician. I'm trying to think of what the current day equivalent would be. I can't think. Copperfield, thank you.
That's all we can think of.
Yes, exactly. The obvious solution to that problem, of course, yes. David Copperfield, so very, very highly respected not only in the world of magic, but also in that world of sort of like paranormal mystery and so on and so forth. And he had visited my cousin and left dumbfounded. He said he could find no explanation for this phenomenon. The stick had been examined. Of course, people had gone in there to try and find the hidden cables and whatever else. And of course, all of this had been thwarted. There was no evidence in any way, physical evidence of any, earthly connection, let's say. So David Nixon left dumbfounded, and of course there was still this cat and mouse game with the press as such, and so it's kind of every time anybody went into the room, all activity would cease, and so there was never a photograph of it or never any pictorial evidence of what was going on. Although I must say, words must have been written because there was certainly an awful lot of interest. And I have, periodically at times over the past, tried to do a little bit of a research to see if I could find any articles that are written, but I could never find anything.
That was the funniest thing, because you used to tell me the story all the time, and as a kid, I'm like, obviously I believe you, but then as I got into the teenage and hateful years,
it was hard to verify.
I couldn't believe you because I couldn't find anything on Google.
I know.
So I thought it was just this long-running joke that the English family was playing on me because I'm so gullible and I believe everything everyone tells me.
The only thing I can suggest is that you actually physically go to the Barnsley Chronicle and look at their microfiche, which is possibly not digitized. I mean, I can imagine that the digitizing process would start from a point and go onwards, but the whole concept of digitizing everything that had gone previous from a newspaper that opened in something like 1817 was, I can't imagine anybody would be interested in financing that project.
But then didn't you also, when you were in the Czech Republic, weren't you watching a TV show? No,
I was just going to come. This was the sort of final punctuation on the story, or actually not quite the final punctuation. But it would have been about, I'm going to say, about 1985, maybe 1986, something like that. I was living in an apartment over on Alexandria in Hollywood. And I came home one night and I switched on a PBS program about unusual paranormal activity and sat back and was just sort of half watching it before I realized, wait a minute, this is the story. They're telling the story on PBS right now.
Yeah.
And sure enough, they were explaining. It was in a sort of a discussion about all sorts of different events, and it was one of these events. So it wasn't like these guys were like focused on this story, but they were reciting a line of events that sort of happened to support whatever their agenda was on that particular article. But I realised, of course, that this was the event, and so before I could, and of course it was before the days where you could simply roll back and review it. But no, it had passed and it was gone, and then that was that. And again, that was the last time until recently. My aunt Inora, God bless her, passed away at 100 years old in. Let's think, June, wasn't it? June of this year.
Yeah.
And I went back, of course, for the funeral. And I was talking to one of the elderly attendees there, a lady who I've known, of course, most of my life, and we were chatting away, and suddenly the question of the walking stick came up. And have you seen so-and-so? Did you know this would happen? And so on and so forth. And so we had a good chat and a review about the events that happened. But to finalise it, it was really the whole sort of event really came to a close on the eve of my cousin's return to school. His headmaster had been to see him that day, and the headmaster had said to him, "Well, I hope this is." Not something that you've been fabricating, because, of course, there's been a lot of interest in it. He says, "Headmaster," he said, "if I was fabricating this, I wouldn't be coming back to school tomorrow." But sure enough, he did return to school, and on the eve of his return, all activity on the stick ceased, and then never returned except for him alone. Once or twice. This would have been, I saw him probably about 10 years later, and he had said that it had happened a couple of times, but he said it never happened again in front of anybody else, just him.
Yeah.
So whether or not that was true or not, I'm not sure. But anyway, there it is. It's still, in my mind, completely as unexplained as it ever was. In a way, I kind of look back on that event fondly now, because, of course, it was so weird and strange and out of context, and yet kind of ordinary, So there it is. That was my paranormal story.
You have any questions, Nikki? So many, but I don't know where to start. So, was this something that... It's Barnsley, right?
Barnsley, South Yorkshire, yeah.
So is that like a small community where people heard about it and that's how the press got interested in it?
Yes, I'm sure it was word of mouth. You definitely have to look at it from the context of 1965, especially in Barnsley, when people really didn't have phones.
Right.
We had a phone because my father had a business, but we were the only phone on the block, and people often would come round and say, do you mind if I call the doctor or whatever? Mm-hmm. So the fact that phones were in there, I suppose she ran a business too, so she would have had a phone, I would have imagined. But, who would you phone?
Right.
There wouldn't be anybody on the other end on a sort of like it would be a business thing. It wouldn't really be a social thing. So
supernatural hotline.
Yeah, but of course, don't forget that she owned a pub, and a pub, of course, is a community gathering, and so word would have got out very quickly, yeah.
Did the pub get really popular?
I'm sure, of course, I didn't really see it from that context,
right.
But I'm sure things would have, boosted a little bit, yeah. People were aware of this thing that was going on.
Yeah. Is your cousin still around?
I have not seen him in, 40 years, so I don't know. I think he is still around, but
right.
We haven't been in touch.
I just can't imagine being like the kid behind the stick that moves.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just, I don't know. Also, it's just, how crazy is it,
Well, it's sort of crazy in its own way, but, it's crazy because we see it in the context of what our sense of normal is,
right.
But who's to say if it's crazy? I mean, it certainly at the time didn't feel as though it felt as though I was catching up with normal rather than that the stick was, in its own world.
Right. Like you said, it is kind of ordinary. It was just a stick moving
It felt
and tapping.
so ordinary.
It wasn't
yeah.
like slashing people. Or
Right.
Killer stick.
It was just a stick that moved.
Right.
Yeah.
But again,
Mines
don't forget that was the viewpoint of a young child.
Right.
And so who's to say what is normal and usual? I mean, every day it seemed as though something crazy was happening,
Did they call a priest?
I don't remember seeing any or hearing anything in context of that. No, I wouldn't have thought so. This was not a Catholic community by any stretch of the imagination.
When talking to Grandpa and Auntie Nora about it later on in life, what were their stances?
Well, I think my father remained pretty sceptical about it for the most part. And I don't know, Auntie Nora, it's hard to say. They were very pragmatic people. They were realists. And so I'm sure they looked at this with the thought of it was, the only thing we're missing here is the connection to who was controlling it. But I don't know. I mean, they were not, terribly vocal about it. I mean, I think there was always everybody that saw it certainly left with a sense of wonderment or questioning as to what it was. But there was I don't think anybody really had a sense of what the whole thing was really about, and there definitely wasn't a sense of like, well, that's the spirit of your great grandmother Jessie or whatever. No, there was not a sense of that really. Our context, our discussions of the stick centered around mostly the relationship between the stick and my grandfather. So that was kind of the area of, I remember, your grandfather, that stick, he had it beside him for years, blah, blah. So it was, we looked at it from the context of the connection to our immediate family mostly.
Yeah. All right.
What was the feeling in the room? Was it like a sense of like wonderment where people were just excited that something that was unexplained was happening? Or was there like a panic of like, this stick is moving?
No, well, that could well have been there at first, but of course I wasn't really privy to the beginnings of it as such. So that could have been present but dissipated by the time I got to it. And so when I got there, the mood in the room was very light and jovial. And still, of course, laced with wonder and amazement, but it wasn't. I got no sense of panic or any darkness at all. Yeah.
Did they ever try to put it back on top of the wardrobe?
I think that there was a reluctance to relegate it back into obscurity. By that time, it had become a little bit of a star. So there was a sense of, there's the stick, as opposed to let's get rid of this piece of old junk.
Right. Well, I just wonder if they had put it back, if it would have ended up halfway down the stairs again.
Right.
Yeah.
If it would have kept moving, or if it was just trying to get to the button.
Yeah.
Well, it did. My cousin did say that it came back to life in parentheses. A couple of times after that, but it was never a public phenomenon.
I just can't imagine being the kid who has a stick that moves around
Yeah.
occasionally.
It's like, most kids want a pet dog. He has like a pet stick that follows him around.
So let me throw in a sort of a little seed of skepticism. And again, it's like I have no concept about how connected this is, but my cousin was definitely interested in the magic arts. And later, I think that interest didn't dissipate. He continued. I have no idea how involved or active he became later. When this happened, he was in early high school years, so this seems as though it would be something that would be incredibly tricky for a kid to pull off. It wasn't as though, these days it seems, of course, living in places like Hollywood or wherever, you can go out and find a store that supplies the professional magician and find these tricks and so on. But that certainly was absolutely not available to us on any level growing up in a small mining town in South Yorkshire in the early 60s. That resource just didn't exist. So I want to err on the side of belief, and I want to believe that this was in some way some kind of phenomena that we can't explain that I witnessed and have experienced. I want to believe that. But yet the skeptic part of me says, and yet, there he was with a very definite interest in the magic arts and illusion.
Yeah.
And so there's always like a little flag that's fluttering that wonders,
I mean, I guess,
did we get the whole story?
Yeah.
But if we didn't get the whole story, do we really care?
I don't
care.
also,
I don't care because I still want to believe. You know?
I mean, but also to that argument, you did say that famous magician came.
David Nixon.
Yeah, and like how, I mean, yes, it's possible that a kid might be able to,
Right.
Confuse a famous magician, but this is a guy that his craft is in that work.
Right.
So how,
Well,
unless he was saying like, oops, I was confused, but he really wasn't.
Well, a magician would never reveal his or any other fellow magician's tricks.
I mean, there's game shows now about that, though. There's a game show with Penn and Teller, and they never reveal, like, oh, yeah, it's clearly, like, using your foot or whatever, but they were like, you haven't fooled us.
Right, well, fair enough.
And so, like, that might be, like, him being like, yeah, he didn't fool me. I know what's going on, right?
Maybe he'd, like, let the kid have his
he
15
might.
minutes of fame.
He might,
Good
right?
job,
He might be
kid.
just being a good guy and all, but also it's just, like, it's very interesting. It's just I don't know, it's a very interesting
cool.
thing. Keeping, but I guess this was, do you have any more questions?
Not that I can think of right now.
It's
just, like you said, it's an interesting story because it is something that's so ordinary, but there's something magical about it.
Absolutely.
It's not what we expect.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
But it's not a demon stick stabbing people in the night. It's just a stick that's moving.
Yeah.
It was a benign presence.
Yeah.
That's the way I think of it. In whatever sense it was, whether it was illusion or whether it was, spiritual or however the source, whatever the source was, it was benign. It was a benign presence that in no way gave any sense of threat, And so I think of that context and the sort of illusion context. And of course, I think, and again, I'm not an illusionist, but my imagination would be in terms of the way an illusionist would be thinking would be in terms of putting on a show. And that would, in essence, creating a sense of danger would be the thing that would be magnetic to people. But there was no sense of that at all, which again sort of leads me back into a sort of a spiritual place. Even though there's no explanation for it, but there was just this sort of sense of calm that I found, well, even now I find, all these years later, almost 10 years later, it's so distinctive, a sense of calmness,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.